Good morning, and I'm so glad that you chose to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online for our continued look at Jesus' X-rated sermon. In his book, Living Jesus, Randy Harris asks the question, who does Monkey Girl marry? I understand that sounds like a strange way to begin our sermon this morning, but it's really a great question. Actually, it's the perfect way to begin our discussion of this last chapter in the X-rated sermon found in Matthew chapter 7. So who does Monkey Girl marry? Apparently, the answer is Alligator Man, and it's a true story. Priscilla was a sideshow freak. Well, that's what they called them in the days before political correctness. She went by the name Monkey Girl, and she fell in love with Emmett, another performer who had the moniker Alligator Man. Monkey Girl had long flowing hair everywhere, including her face, and Alligator Man had reptilian skin. Believe it or not, they met each other, fell in love, and it was quite the romance. I mean, it's really a beautiful story in a Stephen King sort of way. Anyway, they fell in love, they ran off, eloped, and they spent the rest of their lives working together for Ripley's Believe It or Not and Barnum and Bailey Circus. It's a sweet story that actually deserves a Hallmark adaptation. I wanted to start with their story this morning because on those rare occasions when Monkey Girl and Alligator Man are having a disagreement, which leads to some heated words and then basically a knockdown, drag out fight, do you think Monkey Girl ever looked at her husband and said, I should have listened to my parents. I can't believe I married a freak like you, only to catch her own reflection in the mirror? Of course, the point is that we're all a freak of nature in one way or another. This story illustrates that the best way for me to lose my judgmental and critical spirit is to take an honest look at my own life. It's amazing when I look at my own brokenness, I can find the space to be generous towards others. Once I start to deal with my own stuff, then I can be a little more charitable towards you and your stuff. Especially during the Christmas season, we tend to lean towards being generous. And while we normally think about generosity in the realm of giving gifts or giving money, Jesus wants us to think about being generous in a different way. He talks about being generous in the way that we judge other people. We're supposed to act like our Father. We need to base our generosity in the nature of God. We worship a loving and generous God who gives freely to the whole world. Right now, our community has turned its focus to the story of Jesus, God's gift of love to the entire world. Jesus was the greatest gift that God could have ever given. It's the greatest gift we could have ever received. The scriptures tell the story of God's generous nature. He loves to give beautiful and compassionate gifts. His nature of generosity can be seen in everything that he's given us, ranging from the light and the warmth of the sun to his invitation to come and follow him. And God's generosity is not only supposed to be received, but we're supposed to pass on that same graciousness towards other people. You might remember the story Jesus tells in Matthew 18 about the unmerciful servant. Jesus says that a man has embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the king, and when the king was doing some accounting and realized what had been done, he demands that the servant pay back all the money. He says if he can't pay back the money, that I'm going to sell the guilty servant, his wife, his children at the slave market, and finally the king's going to sell all of the servant's possessions, all in an effort to get some of his money back. But the servant throws himself at the king's feet. He begs for a chance to pay it all back. And touched by his plea, the king erases all of the debt. The servant then realizes his days of embezzling are over, so he turns to taking up debt collection. He finds a fellow slave that owes him a few dollars, and he demands his money right now. The second slave didn't have the money, and so he begins to beg for a little time to pay the money back. But the servant who had just been forgiven refuses to show mercy. He has that second slave thrown into prison. When the king hears what happened, he was livid. He told that servant, I canceled your entire debt because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have treated the other servant as mercifully as I treated you? In this parable, Jesus is reminding us that we have received God's beautiful gifts of mercy and compassion and grace. And if we're going to receive those gifts, Well, they come with an expectation that we're going to share them with one another. I'm sure you've heard somebody say that Christians are really judgmental. I've always been amazed that folks live their entire life and never open a Bible, yet they can quote, "Do not judge." Usually people who use this verse, they do it to overrule whatever it is they don't want to hear. They've decided what kind of brokenness they want to live in, and they have no desire for anybody to disagree with their choices. They don't want anyone to pass judgment on their lifestyle. We all understand their sentiment. But if you actually took the time to read the text this morning, to read through this X-rated sermon, you'll find that Jesus doesn't totally prohibit us from making judgments. I mean, after all, you can't get through life without making some judgments. In fact, towards the end of chapter 7, Jesus is going to insist that you need to make some judgments. But his point here is to warn us that we need to be generous when we make those judgments. We need to be as generous to others as we want God to be towards us. When I was a young, newly married man trying to figure the whole world out, God put Jerry Barber in my life. Now, Jerry has always been a wise voice in my journey. One of the very first things Jerry taught me about working with people was the benefit of the doubt principle. He said, when somebody says something that you can take more than one way, your best choice is to give them the benefit of the doubt. That's the opposite of what I've been doing my entire life. When somebody said something to me that I could take one of two ways, I always took it the worst possible way. Yet Jesus is telling us in this text that we need to start by giving people the benefit of the doubt. I wonder what would happen in our community if our generosity had less to do with how much money we gave and more to do with the amount of respect, grace, and love that we were willing to give to other people. If we were willing to start by giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, our world would look a little different. We'd be slower to judge. We would be quicker to practice the golden rule and treat other people the way that we want to be treated. Unfortunately, our first reaction is usually to be overly critical. We want to do a little nitpicking. Jesus says we need to be careful to not have an unloving, holier-than-thou type attitude. Whenever we make a judgment about someone else, we make that judgment based on our life experience. And honestly, that's not enough to make a compassionate, accurate, loving judgment about anybody. You might remember God made the point one time that man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. That's why we don't have the right to sit in judgment on somebody else's motives. We don't know what those motives are. I mean, sure, we see their actions, but we can't see their motives. We can't see other people the way that God does. It's really a complete waste of time to pick through other people's lives, trying to find their mistakes, trying to find their faults. Jesus is calling us to be people who are quick to give the benefit of the doubt. Now, there's not a lot of obvious humor in this X-rated sermon, but there is one section where Jesus seems to kind of play it up for laughs. That's verse 3 when he talks about our propensity to judge others more harshly than we judge ourselves. Jesus says, how are you going to take a speck out of your brother's eye when you got this beam in your own eye? First, take the beam out of your own eye so you can see to take the speck out of your brother's eye. It's this humorous picture of somebody with this big log in their eye trying to do microsurgery on somebody else. It hits us where we live because judgmentalism, it's a way of life for us. I mean, I can be particularly judgmental in those areas where I have my act together. So when I have my act together in a certain area and you don't, it's really easy for me to be judgmental about it. The only areas that I ever want to focus on are the areas where I'm far superior to you. So if we ever get into an area where your life might be better than mine, I'll just change subject. Eventually we'll get to an area where my life is in better shape. Then I can look down on you. We don't like to admit it, but we do it all the time. Maybe Jesus uses this plank and speck of sawdust illustration because he was a carpenter. It was familiar to him. It was familiar to the people gathered on the mountainside listening to the sermon. But I wonder if he were to give this same illustration today, he might change it up a little bit. He might say that a man sitting in judgment of another person is like somebody watching a football game. Have you ever watched somebody watch a football game? Especially if their team is losing. They criticize that the quarterback keeps making poor throws, or the receivers can't catch easy passes, or the linemen don't know how to block anybody. They know how to do everything. And they get angry because the folks on the field, they don't have any idea what they're doing. They don't have the ability to do the simplest things. Watching them quarterback from the recliner would lead you to wonder, if you're so good at knowing what to do, why are you sitting on a couch watching a game instead of being out on the field playing the game? You and I both know the reason that they're on the couch is because they're a terrible football player. I mean, it's actually kind of doubtful they ever played a meaningful football game in their entire life. But have you noticed that you're never judged by people that are doing more than you're doing? You're constantly judged by people who are doing less. Even though we're unqualified, we still judge because it makes us feel better about us. If we have a problem with the sin in our own lives, it takes pressure off me. It takes guilt off if I can just point a finger at you. I mean, my sin doesn't look so bad if I'm talking about your sin. So Jesus warns us, clean up your own act before you tamper with the lives of others. You see, when I spend time pointing my finger at you, my attention is distracted from my own sin. And that's the real danger of judging. While I can clearly see the things in your life that I want to pick on, Jesus says when I do that, I'm overly critical and I'm hypocritical because I can't see the things in my own life. Now, I don't want you to leave here this morning thinking that Jesus is teaching the disciples that they're supposed to stay out of the lives of other people. We're a family. We're in a family, and that calls for us to have some responsibility to each other. We have a responsibility to help each other. Jesus says, first, remove the plank from your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck out of your brother's eye. What's the loving Christian thing to do when you notice that somebody has a speck in their eye? Just kind of turn and walk away and act like it's not there? Do you say, I can never help you deal with a speck in your own eye because, well, I've had specks in my eyes before. I'm not qualified to help. That's ridiculous. Jesus is saying that we have space for discernment. If you see a brother or sister with a speck in their eyes, you need to help them. But first, you got to take the 2x4 out of your own eye. You got to get that self-righteousness away. Paul says, brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. This part of the X-rated sermon doesn't say we overlook sinfulness. Jesus is calling us to be gracious, not to look down in self-righteous judgment on another sinner. After all, we've all fallen short of the glory of God. We can recognize sin as sin. We don't need to justify it. Jesus is warning for us to avoid the extremes of judgment. We need to be careful not to become harshly judgmental, looking for faults, taking every opportunity to look down on others from our position of self-righteousness. We need to live gracious lives of love and compassion. And that doesn't mean that we overlook sin. That means that we recognize sin for what it is. Any attempt to overlook and justify the sin in somebody else's life is, well, it's sin. The most loving thing we can do is reach out a hand of help to other broken people, people who are doing the best they can to make their way through our world. As we make our way to the table this morning, I want us to notice how Jesus actually lived out this teaching. If you look in John chapter 8, you'll find that early one morning, Jesus comes from the Mount of Olives and begins to teach the folks who had gathered at the temple. Suddenly, in the middle of his teaching, there's this rude interruption. The scribes and the Pharisees push their way to the front of the crowd, dragging a woman behind them. With a shove, they push the woman right in front of the crowd, right in front of Jesus, and they sarcastically asked him, "Teacher, this woman was caught red-handed in the very act of adultery. Moses in the law gives orders that we should stone such a person. What do you say?" John tells us they're trying to trap Jesus. They want him to say something incriminating so they could bring up charges against him. You see, the Jewish law says the woman must die, but the Roman law says she can't be killed without their permission. It's quite the conundrum. Do we ignore the law of the land, or do we ignore the law of Moses? So what does Jesus do? Jesus has the moral high ground to judge the woman guilty. I mean, after all, she is guilty. She was caught in the very act of adultery. The law of Moses is clear. She deserved to be stoned, to die for what she had done. But Jesus shows us what it means to judge with grace. He refuses to look down on the woman. He's not going to allow the mob to treat her as a thing. Rather, he forces the mob to consider their own sin. He begins to write in the dirt. And when he finishes writing, he stands up and he says to the religious hypocrites, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And then Jesus simply drops the mic. Jesus knew that the mob was trying to cover up their own sin. And whether it was what he wrote in the dirt or his piercing stare at them, the crowd knew that Jesus knew about their sin. And one by one, they slinked away. But Jesus isn't done. He doesn't just leave it there. Jesus then turns and looks at this woman who is covered with embarrassment and sin. And he doesn't justify her behavior. He addresses her sin with compassion, and he gently told her to go and sin no more. Jesus is willing to call sin a sin. He doesn't want to soften or excuse what she's done. He doesn't say, "I know life is hard, you didn't have any other choices." He doesn't refer to her action as anything other than sin. But in an act of grace, he forgave her. And he challenges her to stop sinning. That's the same way Jesus treats us. He pours out his same love in our lives, but if we're going to receive his grace, there's an expectation that we will share what we've received. As we make our way to the table this morning, we're going to share the emblems. We're going to be called to remember God's love, his forgiveness. The bread reminds us of the body of Christ. The cup reminds us of his blood. And both his body and his blood were given to us as a sacrifice so that God would not only see our sins and our brokenness, he would forgive us. As we take the emblems today, we need to consider a couple questions. First, what do you truly want to hear God say to you? Do you want God to look at you and to call you out for the sin that's in your life? The sin that you have actually committed, the brokenness that actually exists in your life. Is that what you want God to look at and to focus on in your life? Or do you want God to see the blood of Christ? Do you want God to see the fact that Jesus has died so that you could be part of the body? And the second question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we go about sharing that same love that God gives to us to other people in our lives? What do we need to do to give people the benefit of the doubt that we want? What do we need to do to share the love that God gives to us so freely with other people, other broken travelers? We have a great opportunity as we sit at the table this morning to be honest not only about our sin and our sinfulness, but to be honest about the way that we are going to treat and love people who sin like we do and sin differently than we do. I hope your time around the table this morning is beneficial. And I hope and pray this week that you're able to not only experience the love and the grace of God, but you're able to share that with others as well. Go in peace, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.